And now let's move to today's talk, which is going to be very exciting. Luke Stark will talk about artificial intelligence for whose social good. But before that, just a short intro. Luke is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Informatics and Media Studies at the University of Western Ontario. His research focuses on the ethical, historical, and social impacts of computational technologies, such as artificial intelligence and machine learning. So with that, I would like to invite Luke to tell us more about his subject.
Thank you so much, Juana. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really grateful for the invitation. I'm grateful to be in such great company in the rest of the series. So many fabulous folks that you've lined up in this this edition of the festival. So I'm really thrilled to be here. And I should also say I was saying earlier to the organizers I have a soft spot for TU Delft. I was gave one of my first talks about my dissertation research there, and some years ago. I won't say the exact year if you're dating myself, but a great place and lots of great people there. So thank you again for the invitation. I'm just going to share my.
Accepting it.
I'll just share my screen, as I do so, I will also say that the place from which I'm speaking to you and the lands on which the University of Western Ontario is located are the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape-Wuk, and the Attawandaron peoples, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. I ask us to show respect for the longstanding relationship that Indigenous peoples have to these lands in Canada as their original caretakers, and to acknowledge the historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous peoples, including the First Nations peoples, Métis and Inuit, endure in Canada and in other settler colonial territories. Recognizing these painful histories of genocide and forced removal, I ask us to honor the Indigenous communities still living on and connected to these lands. We can do so by striving for restorative justice for Indigenous peoples and for all those who have been marginalized and oppressed. And I don't know, some of you may have heard this week in the international headlines, some of the terrible history of our residential school system here in Canada, where young Indigenous people were taken from their families, maltreated, and sometimes died in great numbers. So this is an ongoing problem in question in Canada. Okay, so the talk today is titled Artificial Intelligence for Whose Social Good? And I'll start a little bit with some background on my work. I sort of wear two hats. One hat is a historical or a historian's hat. And with that hat on, I research kind of critical histories of computing, and especially its intersection with the psychology and sciences. And so my current book project is exploring the history of how emotion has been quantified, understood, often ignored by computer scientists over the last 75 years. But with my non-historical hat, I do much work these days in, I guess, what we would call the fairness and ethics of AI, and the talk today will be largely grounded in that work. And I also have I come to this work on AI out of work on digital privacy and surveillance, and on the kind of ways in which data is being collected about us through various facets of our everyday lives. I'll also just give a quick plug or a quick background note that in my kind of non-historical hat, with my non-historical hat on, I'm heavily influenced by the work of folks, including folks at Delft and certainly other parts of the Netherlands, on values and design. Right, this idea of trying to plot the relationships between human values and technical design, and think about how you would both analyze those relationships and also design potentially more thoughtfully, design with human values in mind. There are many examples of this idea from the philosophy of technology, many methodologies, and so that's part of the background that informs my take on all these topics. So it's interesting that this is a series about data, and of course, these days, data and AI are hard to extricate from each other. the current era, from my read, the current kind of era of focus on the AI side of these computational systems began about 2015, 2016, with a very concerted push by big tech companies to frame this conversation around the idea of ethics, right? And instead of talking about values or talking about societal impacts, this is a headline from the New York Times in 2016 that points to just how central the ethics conversation, the term ethics, was to tech companies like Google, Apple, and sort of their associated initiatives. And alongside this conversation around tech ethics has grown up a kind of related conversation around maybe specifically AI for social good, or more broadly AI for good, which is often meant to describe AI as applied to social or societal problems. And this framing of AI for social good is simultaneously a justification for the enormous hype and financial impetus behind both AI research and commercialization, but also a claim about how societal change can and should happen in a society mediated by computers. And so today I'm going to talk a little more broadly about how this idea of social and society is understood in the history of both AI and data science, and sort of what that tells us about AI's future. I'll sort of start back in 2015 because the impetus for this line of research really started back that far back with thinking about data science and thinking about data ethics, big data, and the impacts of big data. And it was a very generous grant from the Center for Society, Technology, and Policy at UC Berkeley that got me and my colleague Anna Lauren Hoffman, now at the University of Washington, thinking about what was then a big boom, looking at ethics codes for data scientists, right? Data scientists decided that they needed some sort of ethics code, professional ethics codes. And we were interested in this topic, and we were interested in the ways in which data science was or was not drawing on a wide range of inspirations, ethical and societal, for the kind of norms that their professional data science codes would involve. And so this project eventually, after some years, crystallized in a piece from 2019, Data is the New What? Popular Metaphors of Professional Ethics and Emerging Data Cultures. And in this project, what we ended up doing was looking at a variety of ethics codes. Here's my wonderful co-author, Anna Lauren Hoffman. She's now faculty at the University of Washington, as I said. And so one of the things we discovered, or we noted as we began to look at these data science ethics codes and kind of related work on ethics codes in general, was something that sociologists have long known and articulated, it turns out, which is that AI ethics and ethics codes more generally, really have a grounding in business ethics and professional ethics. This is not these data science ethics codes we were looking at. Their history wasn't really in broad, mechanisms to improve the world. They were really in sort of codes that designate and defend social status and expertise, and kind of define the kind of contours of a professional in-group or out-group, right? So professional ethics codes are, medical associations have them, engineering associations have them. These days, many different professions have them. And one of the things about the history of business ethics is that it tends to be quite cyclical and quite reactive and repetitive, right? So business ethics tends to become a topic or an issue when there are problems of social concern that then reflect badly on the profession. And so, as a response, then ethics codes develop, in part to constrain the members of a profession, but also in part to kind of as a kind of management of PR. So within this context, we were interested in what the sociologist Gabriel Abend calls the moral background of business ethics, right? So what the kind of second order social and normative assumptions are about ethics, about what ethics mean, and how it works in professional context. So we're not just talking about the specifics of the codes, but also the kind of larger normative assumptions that ground the development of these codes. And a second kind of thing we noted, actually was suggested by a colleague, Nick Seaver at Tufts, was just how much metaphors around data at the time were proliferating, and how much those metaphors really seem to focus on particular kinds of existing industries, right? So we have all these metaphors thinking about data as a natural resource, right? Data is the new oil, raw data, data ecosystems. There are references to data mining, data exhaust, data trails, oceans of data, deluges of data, right? So these are all metaphors that kind of have to do with natural resources or with kind of natural, data as a kind of feature to be exploited, right? And of course, data is everything from the new oil to the new black to, in fact, the new bacon. So these things can get a little wild. So what we did in this paper was examine two sets of professional ethics codes. The first set of professional ethics codes were ones that already existed or were being developed in computing and information science. So, the Association of Computing Machinery has an ethics code. The IEEE has an ethics code. The American Statistical Association has an ethics code. So we've looked at a bunch of kind of existing computing and information science at professional ethics codes. The second set of ethics codes we looked at, and kind of as a kind of comparison, were ethics codes for professions tied metaphorically to data and to data science, right? So if data is the new oil, maybe looking at the ethics code of petroleum engineers would give us some insights onto the way data is being used. So we looked at that, the Society of American Foresters, the Institute of Hazardous Materials Management, and even the ethics code for the Professional Society for Morticians. And we performed a critical discourse analysis, looking at the ways in which different social actors and social actions got surfaced in these codes, right? Who do these codes understand as having agency? What values are being highlighted? And how should professionals behave? And we sort of looked at the similarities and differences between these two sets of codes, these kind of computer science codes and these other codes. So I'll give you a few of the kind of similarities and differences now. So one of the kind of clear similarities, actually, in some ways across these ethics codes was the way that professional ethics often positions individuals as the primary locus of ethical responsibility, right? Individuals are asked to take the brunt of ethical conflict and kind of adjudicate between potentially conflicting or incommensurate values. And so it was very rare that codes were extended to cover responsibilities of others, especially those above, around, and below individual professions. And actually one way in which this happens this happened more frequently in the kind of non-computer science codes in the foresters and such. It happened in this other set of codes through this notion of stewardship. I'm really not one to carry water for resource extraction companies by any means, but rhetorically, at least, these professional codes have a kind of rhetoric of stewardship and of stewarding natural resources that's quite absent in the kind of data science codes and information science codes that we looked at. One notable exception to that absence was in the ethics code of the American Statistical Association, which is interesting. Another point that we found, and to some extent across these codes, but certainly in the computer science and information science codes, was a kind of focus on one part of what we would call of trust, right, credibility, at the expense of another kind of part of trust, which we would call with beneficence. So credibility, right, it involves technical capacity, whether a person or an institution can perform the task they claim they'll do, right? So, the ACM code, a lot of computer science ethics codes are really focused on credibility, like making sure that professionals can do the programming they say they can do. But the other key aspect of social trust is this idea of beneficence. The notion that a trusted person or organization has the best interests of the truster at heart. And that we really found was lacking in a lot of these computer science ethics codes. And so given the increasing scholarly and public awareness of the social impacts of big data, AI, et cetera, the lack of attention to social beneficence or benevolence in these codes is really notable. It's something we need to think that needs remedy. And then finally, just to tie back to my first theme, we have this idea of a kind of stewardship and exploitation, right? So of course, we know that the real life impacts of data science and AI can be real, or are real, are devastating, right? They result in lost jobs, lost opportunity, sometimes unfair arrest and criminalization. And we make a kind of connection to that and the way that discussions of data as a kind of a natural resource, a force of nature, an industrial product, all erase the human subjects that are being that are producing this data that's being collected. And so you have this kind of rhetorical focus on data as a resource without any of those stewardship notions I already mentioned. And focusing on resource extraction without stewardship is a recipe for exploitation. And so we really found that this analogizing of digital data as a kind of natural resource without stewardship implicitly signals data and the living people involved are open for exploitation. So we were working on this piece, and a colleague of ours, Daniel Green, at the University of Maryland, was interested, was really enthused, and suggested that we do something similar for data science, for AI ethics codes, for AI values statements, principle statements. And this was back in, I guess, early 2018. And if you can believe it, there were only like about 10 or 12 of these that we could find. There weren't that many data science value statements. Of course, in the last 3 years, these things have like popped up literally everywhere. I think there are now, by one count, more than 200 of these. But at the time, there weren't very many. And so we kind of performed a similar analysis of these AI value statements that articulate, kind of visions for the ethical or responsible development of AI. So there's Anna again, and now we're joined by Dan Green at the University of Maryland. So as I say, there are many of these codes, right? Jobin et al. In 2019 analyzed, I think, 84. There are a pile, right? But at the time, we only analyzed 7 of them. These are they, ranging from the kind of ethics code of the Partnership on AI, which is a big industry-backed organization in the States, the Montreal Declaration on Responsible Development of AI, some others, including the ethics statement from the company Axon, which had formerly been known as Taser, but which of course has gotten very involved in the AI ethics world. And we did a frame analysis. So we looked at how different discursive elements in these vision statements are selected for salience or pushed to the background. So we looked at these codes again for common themes, logics, and any divergences. And so one thing to say right off the bat, right, is across these vision statements, these principle statements, and this is something actually that you didn't see in those kind of professional ethics codes that I just mentioned in the first paper. But across these vision statements for AI, there was a kind of emergent acceptance of design as a legitimate site for ethical debate, right? Rather than something that can be delegated to other kind of professional domains like law. And this, for somebody who has, had been working in values and design and the philosophy of technology for a long time, this was like actually surprisingly radical, because for most of the preceding decade, the challenge had been to get policymakers, to get technologists to actually listen to and accept that there are ethics and values that come out of and can influence design decisions. So, okay, somebody is listening, it seems like. And yet, when you dig into these principle statements, there are some commonalities which are sort of unsettling. So one of the commonalities we found across these vision statements, right, was a kind of idea that AI ethics are a universal concern, and that those kind of concerns can be objectively measured. Right, all these statements agree that that the AI is a big problem, it's a big thing, and that you can measure these impacts. You can kind of look in a kind of technocratic way at how these systems are shaping the world, and that those outcomes can maybe be applicable to everybody. It's very universalist. Second is this kind of idea of what we call values-driven determinism. That there's a kind of deterministic framing across these vision statements of AI as a world's historical force of change, right? It's inevitable. It's, again, a force of nature, right? That humans can only react to. But of course, in these same codes, there's a kind of paradox, because AI is also then described as being driven by human values, right? And so being driven by being built by humans. So there's a kind of weird tension here, right? It's a kind of force that we have no kind of proactive control over, but also a force that we're responsible for. And so there's an interesting tension there, right? And that tension is I think solved by kind of another theme we found across these statements, which is the theme of expert oversight. right? That if AI is inevitable and a world historical force, but also is developed by humans, only a select group of experts is able to engage with it and to shape it, right? So these vision statements that we looked at are not mass mobilization documents. They frame ethical design as a project of expert oversight, wherein primarily technical and then secondarily legal experts come together to both articulate the concerns and implement the solutions, which are again primarily technical and secondarily legal, right? So you know, voices in these documents are really very expert focused, technocratic. This is a great example from the Partnership on AI that I put on the screen, right? It explicitly articulates experts versus stakeholders, right? So the idea that like people from a wide variety of walks of life who have different experiences with AI systems, like say Uber drivers, are experts is kind of written out of the equation. And as part, maybe, you know, in this kind of the same vein, you know, these documents position design and not business as the locus of ethical scrutiny, right? So you have a kind of switch here, right? Where by focusing attention on the ethics of design, you focus attention away in large part from the ethics of business decisions, the kind of decisions that companies make. So the consequence of businesses being off the table discursively, is that building better AI, building more responsible AI, is the only path forward, right? It kind of cuts off the idea of not building these systems, not deploying these systems in the first place, and there's no statement about not building offered as an alternative. So these are just a few of the kind of common themes we found. If you're interested, I encourage you to read the paper. But what we took from this analysis was a kind of sketch of AI ML's kind of current moral background. Current is in 2019, 2020, and I think it still applies, which is a kind of deterministic vision of society best addressed through certain kinds of individualized, profit-driven, technical, and design expertise. And so the folks who is benefiting from this moral background, right? The people who are most empowered by that moral background, technical experts, and high level government figures. And so we conclude, right, that actually the current moral background for AI is really incompatible with fully inclusive, equitable, democratic, and just understandings of social life, right? You can't have a democratic approach or engagement with new technologies if those decisions are being driven by a very high level set of experts. And actually, well, this is very typical of how technologies have kind of been treated over the years. I'll come back to that at the end of the talk. Okay, so what do we do? This is I've sort of described some problems. How do we respond to these challenges? I don't want this talk to suggest that I'm entirely against technical or design-based solutions or measures to engage with some of these problems, right? I think these kind of technical and design projects are really necessary, right? As part of a constellation of responses to the development of AI. And so I've been involved in a couple of these, one of which I'll highlight briefly, joint work led by Mike Medeo at Microsoft Research when I was a postdoc there, looks at the kind of co-designing checklist to understand, how different people within computer science organizations understand kind of the challenges around designing around a value like fairness. And in doing that work, also then, and talking to these people about what the challenges are around designing with values like fairness in mind, actually developing a checklist to help them do so more effectively and more thoughtfully. So here are my co-authors, Mike Medeo, Jen Wortman-Vaughan, and Hannah Wallach at Microsoft Research. And this work on checklists, is really part of this broader sense within the technical community, the kind of computer science community, that these technical mechanisms for fairness are important and deserve attention, right? And so this is a cartoon from I think done by the computer scientist Moritz Hart, that kind of shows just in the last 5 years how much enthusiasm, interest, focus, and money has gone into technical metrics around fairness and machine learning. So in this project on checklists, we conducted a variety of interviews, focus groups, and design sessions with about 50 practitioners in various machine learning companies. And what were we looking for? We were looking for what current processes practitioners had for identifying and mitigating issues around AI fairness in their work. What did practitioners want in a fairness checklist? And how did practitioners envision these checklists being implemented in their organizations? And so, very kind of at a very high level, right? We found that organizational processes and cultures really had strong effects on the efficacy of checklists. That's something that is backed up by other studies on checklists in various fields. That we found that as of last year, this may be changing a little bit, internal fairness efforts at various AI companies were really driven by passionate individual advocates, right? So largely these teams were not being formalized. We've seen in the last 6 months a little more formalization of these teams, for better or for worse. We can come back to that in Q&A. Practitioners thought that AI fairness checklists were best aligned with teams' existing workflows, right? So finding productive points already in the design process, the deployment process, where you could insert this kind of productive friction of a checklist. And maybe most importantly, implementing these checklists required support from an organization's culture, its goals, and of course, resources. And so we did produce a kind of multi-stage fairness checklist, and work on this continues in refining it and iterating it in practice. Another element of my work on the sort of technical side of fairness goes to expanding the kind of definitions of fairness that we can actually represent or express in technical language. And I'm doing this with my colleague Ben Fish at Mila and the University of Michigan, who is a computational computer scientist, computer theorist. And so we've been working on taking some of these previous VID methods to apply them to how you would translate particular human values into formal models, computational models, and then do so around a specific set of feminist philosophy, feminist political theory, to kind of solve particular problems in these technical definitions of fairness that haven't been solved. Right, so as many of you may know, when we talk about technical fairness definitions, right, the way that this value gets built into many systems, what we're talking about is equalization of the distribution of resources, right? We have various statistical ways to ensure that a resource, whether that's attention or whether that's a loan or something, is distributed in various equally, but there are also many challenges to these definitions. They don't always work together very well, and they define fairness and equality very narrowly around this distribution of material goods. We're interested in understanding how, more broadly, political philosophies that define fairness and equality around things like the destruction of social hierarchies and the ensuring equal social standing, how those theories might be formalized into computational models. This has been pretty rare, right? It's hard to do that for reasons that may be obvious. And so this project methodologically has involved developing what we call reflexive values for modeling. So again, maybe meta values, I guess you could call it almost a moral background, meta values to try to keep modelers consistent and connected to the particular values they're trying to incorporate into a formal model of a system. And then it's also then seeking to actually model Elizabeth Anderson's theory of relational equality, which again understands equality not as necessarily as the material distribution of goods, but first and foremost the kind of breaking down of unequal social standing and the elimination of interpersonal bigotry and other kinds of forms of social discrimination. And so there's a strong connection between these two ideas, obviously, between social standing and material standing. And some of the insights that we've come to, and this is again work in progress, right, is that you can see in the computational modeling that there is a strong connection between relational and distributional equality, right? To ensure relational equality, equal social standing between people, you also need to have a high degree of distributional equality. Right. So in other words, you can't have like equal distribution of goods without doing something about unequal social hierarchies. So this is great. These are interesting kind of engagement with technical fairness. But I want to come back to this point I made earlier in the talk, right? Which is that it sort of feels like design as a locus of ethical scrutiny is now acceptable to these companies and to these conversations, in part because it shifts the focus away from broader systemic and structural questions around business decisions and societal impacts. And so, through this work, we've been asking this question, right? What if being brushed aside, the kind of extant critiques of AI are being heard by companies, but transformed into something we might not recognize, right? Kind of internalized and thus, kind of defanged as we go along. And this is kind of articulated nicely by this tweet by Eleanor Nelson, who talks about, right, the need for not just kind of technical fairness, to make sure that everybody's treated equally by a system, but also engaging with the ways in which AI systems are part of broader histories of power asymmetries, domination, and injustice. And so in the last piece I'll talk about today, also again with my colleagues Dan and Anna, we look at sort of the broad array of governance mechanisms for AI systems that have been proposed. And in doing so, try to begin the conversation about which of these governance systems, are more or less able to deal with those broader systemic questions of injustice, and in what way. Again, there they are. And so, we identify, I guess, 7 different kind of broad category of governance mechanism extant today. I've already mentioned technical tools, and I've mentioned ethics codes, so I won't go into them again. But another one that's really closely related to those ethics codes are voluntary standardization, right? So the ISO, the IEEE, both have begun ethics standards projects for AI, and again, much like ethics codes and kind of other sort of mechanisms, these are kind of helpful for coordination between businesses, but they're not necessarily dealing with kind of these broader societal outcomes. We have had in the last, I would say, year, a real flurry of high-level and potentially powerful legal and regulatory responses to AI systems, right? So the directive on automated decision-making here in Canada, which applies to the federal government's use of automated decision systems. Of course, the various proposals from the European Commission, and some bills in the United States, although these have not yet been passed. And critical to these various regulatory and legal responses is the idea of an algorithmic impact assessment, right? So the way, how do you evaluate the impacts these systems are having in the real world? So these are useful. This regulatory response is really salutary and great. Although I think, again, right, as with all regulatory responses, the devil's in the details. A kind of related set of conversations to these regulatory moves around governance has been to tie AI to human rights principles, right? To kind of these long-standing frameworks around human rights, and claim that human rights principles are the best way to govern AI systems. And I think there's lots of merit in these mechanisms as well. I think it's important, though, to look at kind of progressive or left-wing critiques of the human rights discourse to note some of the failings and some of the inadequacies of human rights as a framing to actually foster human welfare and human not just kind of a kind of baseline set of human rights, but human flourishing. And then finally, right, all of these conversations are happening against the background of what we could call AI securitization, right? And I think actually, if you think back to those values principles we just talked about, and this idea of experts being the people who should be the ones to deal with AI, right? That's really a hallmark of securitization discourse. Securitization is the idea that some topics are so important, so sensitive, so important for security that they need to be taken out of the hands of democratic polities and given to kind of technical, small groups of technical experts. And so we can see AI as part of a long line of securitization discourses around various technologies, right, ranging from nuclear weapons to to cybersecurity. So by the conclusion of this chapter, what Anna and Dan and I focus on is how important social movements and kind of more radical social justice organizations are to the governance of AI systems, right? That actually we need to be looking at, the kind of social impetus from radically democratic and social democratic principles in order to effectively tackle these systems in a societally fair way. We look at two examples. One example is the kind of labor movement in tech. The labor and unionization has become increasingly salient in Silicon Valley, which is something that about 3 or 4 years ago nobody would have expected. For a European audience, right, this may seem obvious that labor would be an important role here, but it is really foreign to the kind of ideology of Silicon Valley, and of course the United States is extremely policy-wise anti-labor. So labor and the way that workers can then have some control over the kind of products that a company makes is a really critical element to governance. Second, right, are the kind of work of social justice movements such as Black Lives Matter. And other related kind of calls for things like prison abolition and for environmental justice. These organizations have very strong tech policy agendas that have to do with the impacts of these technologies on affected communities, right? So for Black Lives Matter, right, it looks at the way that digital systems and have been used to continue the carceral state against Black people in the United States and elsewhere. For environmental justice, you could look at the way in which digital technologies like AI and blockchain are huge consumers of environmental resources. And so so these systems, these social justice movements and their kind of regimes for governing AI have the opportunity for like interesting competing frames and alternatives to kind of govern these systems progressively. That's the one, that slide. So I'll wrap up there. Thank you all for your attention, and I'm happy to talk about this work and any possible futures going forward. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Luke, for the presentation. It was very, very interesting. So maybe if you have questions, you can raise your hand. Maybe you can unmute yourself and ask the question yourself. So in the meantime, I would like to talk a little bit about the way you perform this coding analysis, let's say, based on framing analysis. And I'm actually curious if you see certain patterns in which people talk about how they incorporate human values, and whether the way people point out these things can lead to different interpretations. So maybe my question is, how open to interpretation these codes or these manifestos that people write about responsible data science or responsible use of data are?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I mean, I think there's one of the limitations of our method, right, is that that we're not exploring the kind of user response to these codes, right? We're looking at what's in the text and how the text has been developed, and what that text then maybe says about, implicitly or explicitly, the kind of process and values of the people who develop the text. But in some ways that doesn't necessarily tell you that much about how these codes are being received and how they're they're open to interpretation, for better or for worse. I'll give you an example. The example for worse is when I've talked about the American Statistical Association's code as being relatively broad and progressive, and it talks about, you know, the need for statisticians to have, you know, to think about societal impact of their work. People who like in statistics are kind of related sort of say, well, that's great, but no, that's not really what happens on the ground, right? It's that this is something that's very much maybe more on paper than it is in practice. But right, of course, we know that these various principle statements are, you know, they can galvanize people to, you know, to think more broadly about you know, the human values at various levels, and there is variation, right? So for instance, the Montreal Declaration for Responsible AI, you know, it really focuses on a human rights framework. It really grounds itself in a human rights framework, whereas many of the other ones don't. So there is variation. I didn't talk much about the variation of the codes, and if we did this, I think if we did this analysis again now with just the volume of codes out there, we might see a more granular set of differences along the lines you're describing in the actual text of the codes. I wouldn't want to do this analysis again because there are so many codes. Job and al, their analysis, which has about 84, is really good because, I mean, they look at the kind of different values that pop up in these codes actually, and they sort of say, well, you know, they're pretty heavy on accountability, you know, kind of light on, you know, flourishing, you know, so they sort of do a kind of values analysis, but maybe that's also not getting quite at how these codes are received. I mean, you know, my guess is that you know, the way these codes are received in practice is sometimes is heterogeneous, and it tends to get filtered through other institutions, right? So like having worked at Microsoft Research, do people at Microsoft Research, you know, do they think about X code or Y code? Maybe not so much. But I think there again, translating these high-level principles from ethics codes into actionable documents like checklists or other guidance, that's where you actually have a mechanism to implement some of those values, because otherwise, you know, it's way too high level.
Thank you. I actually have one more question. So you mentioned at the beginning that data is basically seen as a natural resource, right? So this would mean that it's something that it's expensive, or people, you can have it for a while, but maybe at some point it's gonna disappear. But still, it is a natural resource, and it should be something rich, and still people take it for granted. Especially, in the past few years, many AI systems have been built on data that is already there. However, something that I don't see in this kind of guidelines created by companies or institutes is how the data should be collected, or how the data should be analyzed. And I want to know if you know more about this.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I mean, I think, right, and we really saw this in the privacy world as well, the same tension or the same problem, right, which is kind of you know, a lot of focus on regulation of data use but not collection, and part of that was because in some ways the cat was out of the bag, that all these companies had collected all this data sort of without regulatory oversight, and so it was, you know, it was not, you know, it was sort of not advantageous for them to then give it up, and that seemed to hold for a while, although I think I hope and I think that that collection-based focus on data and analysis may be not as more abundant as you'd think, right? I mean, I think so. This idea of not building or not designing implicitly is about not collecting data, right? So like, right, if you're not going to build or design something, you should not, you know, then why collect the data? That's very much not, I know, very much not the attitude in most of data science, but right, but but this idea of not doing across every stage of the design and deployment life cycle is something I think that is increasingly salient. So yeah, I hope that kind of answers the question. I mean, I think the that regulating use, I think is I don't think we should give up on regulating collection or analysis. I mean, analysis. I mean, there's some interesting work on the role that analysis, aka like, you know, what the algorithm, kind of the models, the algorithmic processes, it does play a big role. Although one scholar has, you know, kind of pointed out that the decision to actually design, like actually develop an AI system, that's kind of the most critical one, right? Once you've done that, then a lot of the potential problems are baked in. So after that, deciding on the particular statistical method of designing a system, that matters, but you know, it's really the decision to do it or not that has the most kind of impact.
Okay, so anybody else would like to ask a question? Yes. Suzanne, maybe you can unmute. Yes.
Yes. Yes, so thank you very much for the talk. I am curious, so I'm a computer scientist, and for me, this sounds very high level and theoretical. And so, the checklists are like one of the ways that you can make it more tangible, but do you have an inkling of for how many of these companies they actually have such checklists, or that these high level ethics codes actually reach the people, you know, who are actually working with this? Or to what extent is it more that you need to have something in place for regulation or public perception, but in practice, you know, how much actually do they do with it? Do you have any idea?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, in the current moment, it's very much probably the latter, right? So high-level codes are aspirational. You know, as I was just saying, like it's whether anybody in a company actually thinks about them that much is unclear, and I don't think very many companies have checklists and or tractable checklists. So there's a kind of set of things you have to do. You have to design a checklist that actually makes sense, because a checklist that doesn't make sense, and there's examples of this in the non-AI literature, can be worse than neutral, right? I think a famous example is from aeronautics, where a kind of badly designed checklist meant that you actually a flight almost crashed because they didn't realize they didn't have enough fuel in one wing. So a bad checklist can be actually worse than nothing. So no, I mean, I think this is, so when we did this work on checklists last year, this was like, there had been some people who had done checklists, but they had not been co-designed, and they hadn't been as directly integrated into the communities of practice in computer science. Another challenge here, right, is to look at different firms, different sizes of different CS firms or AI firms, right? Because, you know, it'll be easier for a very large firm like Microsoft to, you know, it has the resources, but also the internal infrastructure to begin to like scale up these checklists and get them in place. They have a legal team. I was involved in a kind of assessment, an internal assessment of the high-level expert group on AI, the European high-level expert group on AI, and it's very lengthy checklists. I don't know if maybe some folks here have seen that. And that was really, we were kind of like, well, this is really not very tractable, because most of the questions would need like a whole bunch of different people from different teams to answer them. They seem all over the place, right? So I think it's really important, if, you know, and then also, of course, it would involve, like, doing that kind of response is much easier for a big company than it is for a small company. So one area of research that I would love to see more of, I don't do this myself, is to think about the ways that AI regulation can be designed that is both has teeth, like a lot of teeth, but that actually is less beneficial, let's say, to large incumbents, right, than to small startups. Because, right, so how to combine anti-monopoly or anti-oligopoly kind of policy with ethics regulation, because that's like that's what would be really interesting to do, and I haven't seen any work on that. The other thing to say, right, is that the effectiveness of things like checklists is only as effective, right, as I was saying, as the organizational buy-in. Although, I mean, I'm sure you can attest to this, right? Lots of people who work in the AI space care a lot about these issues, right? And in some ways, checklists are a useful framework or scaffold to surface these. It's what Katie Shilton calls values levers. They surface these conversations. They get people talking and considering these problems. But but at a certain level, if senior leadership is not playing by those same rules, it's going to be harder. And I think, I mean, a good example is Google has this amazing ethics AI team. Their work, is perceived by some people in senior leadership as too threatening to the company's business model, and so they fire the heads of the AI team. So which is why, again, I say things like checklists and these other kind of internal technical mechanisms are necessary, because that's how things are going to change in the guts of the systems. But you also then need the regulation to make sure everybody is changing in the same direction, and ensuring, right, that the space of possibility for design is in a particular way. That was a very long-winded answer, but I hope that helped.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Yeah, I feel that there's also a tension between sort of high-level idealistic goals, saying like, yes, we want things to be fair, like obviously we do, but they're just looking at fairness in machine learning and the gazillion different definitions of fairness that are used and then implemented. It's like, which one do you pick? When is it fair? And how do you do this in practice?
Right. Well, exactly. And so this is where this work we've been doing on meta values, like, we hope that's kind of helpful, because it before you even decide which fairness metric to pick, I mean, and there's actually been some other really good work. I was just rereading Sorel Friedlander Ayal's piece on the impossibility of fairness this morning for something else, and they make the point that, like, right, the problem, of course, is that you have the concept space and you have the descriptive space, and the proxy observational data you're using in the descriptive space may not actually match the concept you're trying to, right, which is something that, like, people in social science have known for a long time, but it's very challenging. So I mean my plug as somebody trained in the humanities is, that the teams that are doing this work need to be genuinely interdisciplinary and need to have, people who have really strong knowledge, both of statistical methodology and also of, let's say, content domains, or whatever the kind of particular domain that the system is working in. And actually, one of the things we recommend in this paper with Ben Fish and I is really that you shouldn't be recycling systems or models. You should be just building models fresh as much as possible for every context, which also goes against some things in computer science that people like to do. But that kind of plug and play attitude is one of the problems. I also really highly recommend a piece by Andrew Selbst, all Fairness and Abstraction and Sociotechnical Systems, which is really good on some of the kind of what they call abstraction traps, which designers can fall into. I'm gonna just try to find that, put it in the chat. They kind of look at some of the traps that designers can fall into when they're trying to do, right, abstract discretizing work.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for the pointer.
Welcome.
Thank you. And now we have a question from Jie.
Yes. Thank you, Luke, very much for the great talk. So I'm from a computer science background. So I was very much triggered when you were saying that, computer scientists tend to collect as much data as possible, right, in the model training for building AI systems, which pointed to the fact that people from different backgrounds might have very different mindset, right, about how to deal with those data. So the question that I was having is that, can we do something in education to make it different? What would be the suggestion that you have in order to change this?
Yeah. This is another huge and important area in this field. The short answer is yes. I mean, of course, yes. If you change the training of computer scientists, it will help a lot in this context. How you do that is, again, kind of maybe one of the questions. One thing to say is that the structure of computer science departments, and at least in North America, and I can't speak to Europe as much or other parts of the world, but one of the things I think people are finding is as we begin to think about pedagogy around the kind of societal impacts of computing, right, is, you know, I mean, it's what is a societal impact and how is it taught, right? So here in Canada, you know, computer engineers are one discipline that does work in this space, and they've had mandatory ethics training in classes for a long time, professional ethics, right? And, you know, tied in some ways to the kind of the historic reaction to the historical fact that, like, if a bridge falls down and kills a bunch of people, the engineer is on the hook. So that's something, that's a start, but of course, because, you know, the backgrounds from which people come into computing as an industry are so heterogeneous, again, right? Computer science, physics, right? There's all these different people have different backgrounds, so they might not get the same ethics training. There's also the question, right, of not wanting to of wanting to preserve a richness of that societal impacts training, right? So there are these kind of questions about whether or not all, you know, so who should be teaching societal impact of these systems to everybody, to engineers or anybody else, right? Should it be the kind of CS folks doing some, you know, doing a little reading up? Should it be people who have like deep training in these questions? Should it be both? It probably should be both. And that runs up against various questions, especially in North America, where we're having a real, just one of a series of attacks on the humanities, right? On kind of creative fields and universities, right? It sort of then goes into money and resources and who gets credit for what. And I think one big concern I and other folks in this field have is that ethics is going to be essentially taken by computer science. You know, ethics will become a kind of tick box thing that a few people in computer science teach, and nothing is fundamentally going to change, right, in terms of mindset, as you're saying. Because the best schemes for really radically changing the curricula on these topics, involve team teaching, right? Involving collaborations between folks from the social sciences and humanities with computer scientists and other scientists, and which involves involves a lot more than just throwing two people into a classroom, but involves preparation. It involves support for that preparation, kind of pedagogically and professionally. And then even if you've done all of that at the university level, then you've still got if the incentives within the industry don't change because of regulation or whatever, then you've just given all these people a lot of great training and insights and thoughtfulness, and then you're getting them to do the same crap they were doing before. So yeah, that's another long-winded answer. But I think so in some ways, actually education. This is a really good point. Education. I will think about this. That to see education and pedagogy as a governance mechanism that needs to work in conjunction with all these other governance mechanisms is actually a really powerful way of thinking about it.
Thanks for sharing the very deep thoughts.
Complicated, always complicated.
We have one more question from Ersi. Maybe you would like to unmute and ask the question. Otherwise, in the interest of time, I will do it myself. So first of all, thank you for the presentation. You mentioned earlier the need of an interdisciplinary perspective for designing ethical machine learning frameworks, and also the crucial role of the individual and the feminist ethics as well. Do you therefore think that virtue ethics and an ethics of care framework is most useful for designing and also employing social values as equity and race and gender equality?
That's a great question. I mean, I wouldn't want to say that they're most useful, but I think they're very useful. I think those are very useful frameworks. There has been some work in human-computer interaction on incorporating care ethics into the design of not necessarily AI, but other kind of AI systems. There's been some work on ethics of care in the context of social computing spaces like maker spaces. Yeah, I think they're really important. I mean, I think again, the translation needs to be sophisticated, right? And I think in general, there's always a bit of a danger in saying, well, this is a fair system or this is a caring system, right? And having that kind of label on a system, when actually, right, that even systems designed along the principles of care ethics or you know, can still in the wrong context and in the wrong way potentially have negative outcomes. But yes, I absolutely agree. I think these are precisely the kinds of like broadened kind of value systems that don't get articulated a lot in AI ethics work, and that's what we're kind of trying to do.
Thank you. I have one question as a final one. So in our group, we focus a lot on human-centered AI. So we try to integrate humans in the systems that we build. We talk about experts, we talk about stakeholders. Do you have some advice on how to do this better? And what are criteria that we should focus on?
Yeah, I'll just find a paper that I really like on this topic by Mona Sloan, who's at NYU, and some other folks on participation washing in AI. And I think, right, I mean, I think that I mean the same trajectory of questions and challenges affects human-centered AI as has affected HCI more broadly, right? Which is sort of to say, okay, so you know, you have various kind of design methods for working with people. Participatory design is often held up as one of the most engaged, inclusive. Although then, you know, participatory design comes out of a very specific context. It often gets applied in a kind of surface level way. So I think there's been a lot of work on that in HCI. So it's like, you know, thinking about reflective design. We talk a lot about reflection in this paper with Ben. I'll just put that paper in the chat too. But you know, none of these are panaceas. And I think in all these contexts, taking the time and putting the resources into doing these kind of participatory methods properly is the key. It's, you know, you can't rush it, and you also have to be able to say no, right? And so I think again, the idea of putting a human in the loop or involving humans in the system is also not a panacea, right? I mean, human, you know, in some ways, in many contemporary AI systems, broadly understood, humans are in the loop, and they often function, you know, as what Madeline English calls, you know, moral crumple zones, right? They take on the blame if something goes wrong. So I think that the same challenges that have beset HCI in this regard are going to sort of be similar in human-centered AI. And I think this piece by Sloanail is really good because it kind of looks at that problem and it kind of says, you know, don't, you know, be attuned to the ways that participation can be a code for extraction as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the answer. And also thank you very much for the presentation and for all the thoughts that you shared with us today. I think we are gonna end now, and we'll see next week with the next presentation.
Great, thanks
everybody.
Thanks for coming. Take care.